Theme 6: The Three Orders. In this chapter, we shall learn about the socio-economic and political changes which occurred in Western Europe between the 9th and 16th centuries. After the fall of the Roman Empire, many groups of Germanic people from Eastern and Central Europe occupied regions of Italy, Spain, and France. In the absence of any unifying political force, military conflict was frequent, and the need to gather resources to protect one's land became very important. Its features were derived from both Imperial Roman traditions and German customs. Christianity, the official religion of the Roman Empire from the 4th century, survived the collapse of Rome and gradually spread to Central and Northern Europe. The Church also became a major landholder and political power in Europe. The three orders, the focus of this chapter, are three social categories: Christian priests, land owning nobles, and peasants. The changing relationships between these three groups was an important factor in shaping European history for several centuries. Over the last 100 years, European historians have done detailed work on the histories of regions, even of individual villages. This was possible because from the medieval period there is a lot of material in the form of documents, details of land ownership, prices, and legal cases. For example, churches kept records of births, marriages, and deaths, which have made it possible to understand the structure of families and population. The inscription in churches give information about traders, association, and songs, and stories give a sense of festivals and community activities. All these can be used by historians to understand economic and social life and changes over a long period, like increase in population, or over a short period, like peasant revolts. Of the many scholars in France who have worked on feudalism, one of the earliest was Bloch. Marc Bloch, 1886 to 1944, was one of a group of scholars who argued that history consisted of much more than just political history, international relations, and the lives of great people. He emphasized the importance of geography in shaping human history and the need to understand the collective behavior or attitudes of groups of people. Bloch's feudal society is about European, particularly French, society between 900 and 1300, describing in remarkable detail social relations and hierarchies, land management, and the popular culture of the period. His career was cut short tragically when he was shot by the Nazis in the Second World War. An introduction to feudalism. The term feudalism has been used by historians to describe the economic, legal, political, and social relationships that existed in Europe in the medieval era. Derived from the German word feud, which means a piece of land, it refers to the kind of society that developed in medieval France and later in England and in southern Italy. In an economic sense, feudalism refers to a kind of agricultural production which is based on the relationship between lords and peasants. The latter cultivated their own land as well as that of the lord. The peasants performed labor services to the lords, who in exchange provided military protection. They also had extensive judicial control over peasants. Thus, feudalism went beyond the economic to cover the social and political aspects of life as well. Although its roots have been traced to practices that existed in the Roman Empire and during the age of French King Charlemagne, feudalism as an established way of life in large parts of Europe may be said to have emerged later in the 11th century. France and England. Gaul, a province of the Roman Empire, had two extensive coastlines, mountain ranges, long rivers, forests, and large tracts of plains suited to agriculture. The Franks, a Germanic tribe, gave their name to Gaul, making it France. From the 6th century, this region was a kingdom ruled by Frankish French kings who were Christian. The French had very strong links with the church, which were further strengthened when in 800 the Pope gave King Charlemagne the title of Holy Roman Emperor to ensure his support. Across a narrow channel lay the island of England, Scotland, which in the 11th century was conquered by a duke from the French province of Normandy. The three orders. French priests believed in the concept that people were members of one of the three orders, depending on their work. A bishop stated, "Here below some pray, others fight, still others work." Thus the three orders of society were broadly the clergy, the nobility, and the peasantry. In the 12th century, Abbess Hildegard of Bingen wrote, "Who would think of herding his entire cattle in one stable, cows, donkeys, sheep, goats without difference? Therefore it is necessary to establish difference among human beings so that they do not destroy each other. God makes distinction among his flock, in heaven as on earth. All are loved by him, yet there is no equality among them." The second order, the nobility. Priests placed themselves in the first order and nobles in the second. The nobility had in reality a central role in social processes. This is because they controlled land. This control was the outcome of practice called vassalage. The kings of France were linked to the people of vassalage, similar to the practice among the Germanic peoples of whom the Franks were one. The big landowners, the nobles, were vassals of the king, and peasants were vassals of the landowners. A nobleman accepted and a nobleman accepted the king as his seigneur, and they made a mutual promise. The seigneur was derived from a word meaning one who provided bread, would protect the vassal, who would be loyal to him. This relationship involved elaborate rituals and exchange of vows taken on the Bible in the church. At this ceremony, the vassal received a written charter, or a staff, or even a clot of earth, as a symbol of the land that was being given to him by his master. The noble enjoyed a privileged status. He had absolute control over his property in perpetuity. He could raise troops called feudal levies. The lord held his own courts of justice and could even coin his own money. He was the lord of all the people settled on his land. He owned vast tracts of land which contained his own dwellings, his private fields and pastures, and the homes and fields of his tenant peasants. His house was called a manor. His private lands were cultivated by peasants, who were also expected to act as foot soldiers in battle when required, in addition to working on their own farms. The manorial estate. A lord has his own manor house. He also controlled villages. Some lords controlled hundreds of villages where peasants lived. A small manorial estate could contain a dozen families, while a larger estate might include 50 or 60. Almost everything needed for daily life was found on the estate. Grain was grown in the fields, blacksmiths and carpenters maintained the lord's implements and repaired his weapons, while stonemasons looked after his buildings. Women spun and wove fabric, and children worked in the lord's wine presses. The estate has extensive woodlands and forests where the lords hunted. They contained pastures where his cattle and his horses grazed. There was a church on the estate and a castle for defense. From the 13th century, some castles were made bigger for use as a residence for a knight's family. In fact, in England, castles were practically unknown before the Norman conquest and developed as centers of political administration and military power under the feudal system. The manor could not be completely self-sufficient because salt, millstone, and metalware had to be obtained from outside sources. Those lords who wanted a luxurious lifestyle and were keen to buy rich furnishings, musical instruments, and ornaments not locally produced had to get these from other places. The knights. From the 9th century, there were frequent localized wars in Europe. The amateur peasant soldiers were not sufficient, and good cavalry was needed. This led to the growing importance of a new section of people, the knights. They were linked to the lords just as the latter were linked to the king. The Lord gave the knight a piece of land called fief and promised to protect it. The fief could be inherited. It extended to anything between 1,000 and 2,000 acres or more, including a house for the knight and his family, a church, and other establishment to house his dependents, besides a watermill and wine press. As in the feudal manner, the land of the fief was cultivated by peasants. In exchange, the knight paid his lord a regular fee and promised to fight for him in war. To keep up their skills, knights spent each day fencing and practicing tactics with dummies. A knight might serve more than one lord, but his foremost loyalty was to his own lord. In France, from the 12th century, minstrels travelled from manor to manor, singing songs which told stories partly historical, partly invented, about brave kings and knights. In an age when not too many people could read and manuscript a few, these travelling bards were very popular. Many manors had a narrow balcony above the large hall where the people of the manor gathered for meals. This was the minstrels' gallery, from where singers entertained nobles while they feasted. The first order, the clergy. The Catholic Church had its own laws, own lands given to it by the rulers, and could levy taxes. It was thus a very powerful institution which did not depend on the king. At the head of the Western Church was the Pope. He lived in Rome. The Christians in Europe were guided by bishops and clerics, who constituted the first order. Most villages had their own church, where people assembled every Sunday to listen to the sermon by the priest and to pray together. Everyone could not become a priest. Serfs were banned, as were the physically challenged. Women could not become priests. Men who became priests could not marry. Bishops with the religious nobility, like lords who owned vast landed estates, the bishops also had to use the vast estates and live in grand palaces. The church was entitled to a tenth share of whatever the peasants produced from their land over the course of the year, called a tithi. Money also came in the form of endowments made by the rich for their own welfare and the welfare of the deceased relators in the afterlife. Some of the important ceremonies conducted by the church copied formal customs of the feudal elite. The act of kneeling while praying with hands clasped and head bowed was an exact replica of the way in which a knight conducted himself while taking vows of loyalty to his lord. Similarly, the use of the term Lord for God was another example of feudal culture that found its way into the practices of the church. Thus, the religious and the lay worlds of feudalism shared many customs and symbols. Monks. Apart from the church, devout Christians had another kind of organization. Some deeply religious people chose to live isolated lives, in contrast to clerics who live amongst people in towns and villages. They live in religious communities called abbeys or monasteries, often in places very far from human habitation. Two of the more well known monasteries were those established by Saint Benedict in Italy in 529 and of Cluny in Burgundy in 910. Monks took vows to remain in the abbey for the rest of their lives and to spend their time in prayer, study, and manual labor, like farming. Unlike priesthood, this life was open to both men and women. Men became monks and women became nuns. Except in a few cases, all abbeys were single sex communities, that is, there were separate abbeys for men and women, like priests, monks, and nuns did not marry. From small communities of 10 or 20 men or women, monasteries grew to communities often of several hundred, with large buildings and landed estates, with attached schools or colleges and hospitals. They contributed to the development of the arts. Abbess Hildegard was a gifted musician and did much to develop the practice of community singing of prayers in church. From the 13th century, some groups of monks called friars chose not to be based in a monastery but to move from place to place, preaching to the people and living on charity. In Benedictine monasteries, there was a manuscript with 73 chapters of rules which were followed by monks for many centuries. Here are some of the rules they had to follow. Chapter 6. Permission to speak should rarely be granted to monks. Chapter 7. Humility means obedience. Chapter 33. No monk should own private property. Chapter 47. Idleness is the enemy of the soul, so friars and sisters should be occupied at certain times in manual labor and at fixed hours in sacred reading. Chapter 48. The monastery should be laid out in such a way that all necessities be found within its bounds: water, milk, garden, workshops. By the 14th century, there was a growing uncertainty about the value and purpose of monasticism. In England, Langland's Pond, Piers Plowman, c. 1360 to 70, contrasted the ease and luxury of lives of some monks with the pure fate of simple ploughmen and shepherds and poor common labourers. Also in England, Chaucer wrote to Canterbury Tales, which had comic portraits of a nun, a monk, and a friar. The Church and the Society. Though Europeans became Christian, they still held on to some of their old beliefs in magic and folk traditions. Christmas and Easter became important dates for the 4th century. From the 4th century, Christ's birth, celebrated on 25th December, replaced an old pre-Roman festival, the date of which was calculated by the solar calendar. Easter marked the crucifixion of Christ and his rising from the dead, but its date was not a fixed one because it replaced an older festival to celebrate the coming of spring after a long winter, dated by the lunar calendar. Traditionally, on that day, people of each village used to make a tour of their village lands. With the coming of Christianity, they continued to do this, but they called the village the parish, the area under the supervision of one priest. Overworked peasants welcomed holidays because they were not expected to work then. These days were meant for prayer, but people usually spent a good part of them having fun and feasting. Pilgrimage was an important part of a Christian's life, and many people went on long journeys to shrines of martyrs or to big churches. When in April the sweet showers fall and pierce the drought of March to the root, and the small birds are making melody that sleep away the night with open eye, so nature pricks them and their heart engages, then people long to go on pilgrimages, and farmers long to seek foreign shrines of far-off saints revered in various lands, and especially from every shire of England to Canterbury they make their journey. Geoffrey Chaucer, The Canterbury Tales. This was written in Middle English, and the verse is a translation in modern English. The third order: peasants, free and unfree. Let us now turn to the vast majority of people, namely those who sustain the first two orders, cultivators, of two kinds, free peasants and serfs, from the verb to serve. Free peasants held their farms as tenants of the Lord. The men had to render military service at least 40 days every year. Peasant families had to set aside certain days of the week, usually 3, but often more, when they would go to the Lord's estate and work there. The output from such labor, called labor rent, would go directly to the Lord. In addition, they could be required to do other unpaid labor services like digging ditches, gathering firewood, building fences, and repairing roads and buildings. Besides helping in the fields, women and children had to do other tasks. They spun thread, wove cloth, made candles, and pressed grapes to prepare wine for the Lord's use. There was one direct tax called tithe that kings sometimes imposed on peasants. The clergy and nobles were exempted from paying this. Serfs cultivated plots of land, but these belonged to the Lord. Much of the produce from this had to be given to the Lord. They also had to work on the land which belonged exclusively to the Lord. They received no wages and could not leave the estate without the Lord's permission. The Lord claimed a number of monopolies at the expense of the serfs. Serfs could use only their Lord's mill to grind their flour, his oven to make their bread, and his wine presses to distill wine and beer. The Lord could decide whom a serf should marry or might give his blessing to the serf's choice, but on payment of a fee. England. Feudalism developed in England from the 11th century. The Angles and Saxons from Central Europe had settled in England in the 6th century. The country's name England is a variant of Angle land. In the 11th century, William the Duke of Normandy crossed the English Channel with an army and defeated the Saxon king of England. From this time, France and England were often at war because of disputes over territory and trade. William I had the land mapped and distributed in it sections of to 180 Norman nobles who had migrated with him. The lords became the chief tenants of the king and were expected to give him military help. They were obliged to supply a certain number of knights to the king. They soon began to give some of their own lands to knights who would serve them just as they in turn served the king. They could not, however, use their knights for private warfare, which was forbidden in England. Anglo Saxon peasants became tenants at various levels of landholders. Factors affecting social and economic relations. While members of the first two orders saw the social system as stable and unchanging, there were several processes which were transforming the system. Some of these, such as changes in the environment, were gradual and almost imperceptible. Others were more dramatic, like the changes in agricultural technology and land use. These in turn were shaped by and had an effect on the social and economic ties between lords and vassals. Let us examine these processes one by one. The environment. From the 5th to the 10th centuries, most of Europe was covered with vast forests. Thus, the land available for agriculture was limited. Also, peasants dissatisfied with their conditions could flee from oppression and take refuge in the forest. Europe was undergoing an intensely cold climatic spell in this period. This led to severe and prolonged winters, a shortened growing season for crops, and reduced yields from agriculture. From the 11th century, Europe entered a warm phase. Average temperatures increased, which had a profound effect on agriculture. Peasants now had a longer growing season, and the soil, now less subjected to frost, could be more easily plowed. Environmental historians have noted that there was a significant receding of forest line in many parts of Europe. This made expansion of area under cultivation possible. Land use. Initially, agricultural technology was very primitive. The only mechanical aid available to the peasant was the wooden plough, drawn by a team of oxen. This plough could at best scratch the surface of the earth and was unable to fully draw out the natural productivity of the soil. Agriculture was therefore very labor intensive. Fields had to be dug by hand, often once in few 4 hours, 4 years, and enormous manual labor was required. Also, ineffective method of crop rotation was in use. The land was divided in half. One field was planted in autumn with winter wheat, while the other field was left fallow. Rye was planted on this piece of fallow land the next year, while the other half was put to fallow. With this system, the soil slowly deteriorated and famines were not uncommon. Chronic malnutrition alternated with devastating famines, and life was difficult for the poor. Despite these hardships, the Lord were anxious to maximize their incomes. Since it was not possible to increase output from the land, the peasants were forced to bring under cultivation all the land in manorial estate and spend more time doing this than they were legally bound to do. The peasants did not bow quietly to oppression. Since they could not protest openly, they resorted to passive assistance. They spent more time cultivating their own fields and kept much of the product of that labor for themselves. They also avoided performing unpaid extra services. They came into conflict with the lords over pasture and forest lands and saw these lands as resources to be used by the whole community, while the lords treated these as their private property. New agricultural technology. By the 11th century, there is evidence of several technological changes. Instead of the basic wooden plows, cultivators began using heavy iron tip plows and moldboards. These plows could dig much deeper and more boards turned the topsoil properly. With this, the nutrients from the soil were better utilized. The methods of harnessing animals to the plow improved. Instead of the neck harness, the shoulder harness came into use. This enabled animals to exert greater power. Horses were now better shod with iron horseshoes which prevented foot decay. There was increased use of wind and water energy for agriculture. More water powered and wind powered mills were set up all over Europe for purposes like milling corn and pressing grapes. There were also changes in land use. The most revolutionary one was the switch from a two field to a three field system. In this, peasants could use a field 2 years out of three if they planted it with one crop in autumn and a different crop in the spring and half later. That meant that farmers could break their holdings into three fields. They could plant one with wheat or rye in autumn for human consumption. The second could be used in spring to raise peas, beans, and lentils for human use, and oats and barley for the horses. The third field lay fallow. Each year they rotated the use among the three fields. With these improvements, there was an almost immediate increase in the amount of food produced from each unit of land. Food availability doubled. The greater use of plants like peas and beans meant more vegetable proteins in the diet of the average European and a better source of fodder for the animals. For cultivators, it meant better opportunities. They could now produce more food from less land. The average size of peasants' farms shrank from about 100 acres to 20 to 30 acres by the 13th century. Holdings which were much smaller could be more efficiently cultivated and reduce the amount of labor needed. This gave the peasants time for other activities. Some of these technological changes cost a lot of money. Peasants did not have enough money to set up watermills and windmills, therefore, the initiative was taken by the lords. But peasants were able to take the initiatives in many things, such as extending arable land. They also switched to the three field rotation of crops and set up small forges and smithies in the villages where iron tipped plows and horseshoes were made and repaired cheaply. From the 11th century, the personal bonds that had been the basis of feudalism were weakening because economic transactions were becoming more and more money based. Lords found it convenient to ask for rent in cash, not services, and cultivators were selling their crops for money instead of exchanging them for other goods. The traders who would then take such goods to be sold in the towns. The increasing use of money began to influence prices, which became higher in times of poor harvests. In England, for instance, agricultural prices doubled between 1270s and the 1320s. A fourth order, new towns and townspeople. Expansion in agriculture was accompanied by growth in three related areas: population, trade, and towns. From roughly 42 million in 1000, Europe's population stood at 62 million around 1200 and 73 million in 1300. Better food meant a longer lifespan. By the 13th century, an average European would expect to live 10 years longer than in the 8th century. Women and girls had shorter lifespan compared to men because the latter ate better food. The towns of the Roman Empire had become deserted and ruined after its fall. But from the 11th century, as agriculture increased and became able to sustain higher levels of population, towns began to grow again. Peasants who had surplus grain to sell needed a place where they could set up a selling center and where they could buy tools and cloth. This led to the growth of periodic fairs and small marketing centers, which gradually developed town like features: a town square, a church, roads where merchants built, shops and homes, an office where those who governed the town could meet. In other places, towns grew around large castles, bishops' estates, or large churches. In towns, instead of services, people paid a tax to the lords who owned the land on which the town stood. Towns offered the prospect of paid work and freedom from the lords' control for young people from peasants' families. Town air makes free was a popular saying. Many serfs craving to be free ran away and hid in towns. If a serf could stay for 1 year and 1 day without his lord discovering him, he would become a free man. Many people in towns were free peasants or escaped serfs who provided unskilled labor. Shopkeepers and merchants were numerous. Later, there was need for individuals with specialized skills, like bankers and lawyers. The bigger towns and populations had populations of about 30,000. They could be said to have formed a fourth order. The basis of economic organization was the guild. Each craft of industry was organized into a guild, an association which controlled the quality of the product, its price, and its sale. The guild hall was a feature of every town. It was a building for ceremonial functions and where the heads of all guilds met formally. Guards patrolled the town walls, and musicians were called to play at feasts and in city civic processions, and innkeepers looked after travelers. By the 11th century, new trade routes with West Asia were developing. Scandinavian merchants were sailing south from the North Sea to exchange furs and hunting hogs for cloth. English traders came to sell tin. In France, by the 12th century, commerce and crafts began to grow. Earlier, craftsmen used to travel from manor to manor. Now they found it easier to settle in one place where goods could be produced and traded for food. As the number of towns grew and trade continued to expand, town merchants became rich and powerful and rivaled the power of nobility. Cathedral towns. One of the ways that rich merchants spent their money was by making donations to churches. From the 12th century, large churches called cathedrals were being built in France. These belonged to monasteries, but different groups of people contributed to their construction with their own labor, materials, or money. Cathedrals were built to stone and took many years to complete. As they were being built, the area around the cathedrals became more populated, and when they were completed, they became centers of pilgrimage. Thus, small towns developed around them. Cathedrals were designed so that the priest's voice could be heard clearly within the hall where large numbers of people gathered, and so that the singing by monks could sound beautiful and the chiming bells calling people to prayer could be heard over a great distance. Stained glass was used for windows. During the day, the sunlight would make them radiant for people inside the cathedral, and after sunset, the light of candles would make them visible to people outside. The stained glass windows narrated the stories in the buildings in the Bible through pictures, which illiterate people could read. Because of the inadequacy which we often felt on feast days, for the narrowness of the place forced the women to run towards the altar upon the heads of the men with much anguish and noisy confusion to enlarge and amplify the noble church. We also caused to be painted by the exquisite hands of many masters from different regions, a splendid variety of new windows, because these windows are very valuable on account of their wonderful execution and the profuse expenditure of painted glass and sapphire glass. We appointed an official master craftsman for their protection and also a goldsmith who could receive their allowances, namely coins from the altar and flour from the common storehouse of the brethren, and who would never neglect their duty to look after these works of art. Abbot Suger, about the Abbey of Saint Denis near Paris. The crisis of the 14th century. By the early 14th century, Europe's economic expansion slowed down. This was due to three factors. In Northern Europe, by the end of the 13th century, the warm summers of the previous 300 years had given way to bitterly cold summers. Seasons for growing crops were reduced by a month, and it became difficult to grow crops on higher ground. Storms and oceanic flooding destroyed many farmsteads, which resulted in less income in taxes for governments. The opportunities offered by favorable climatic conditions before the 13th century had led to large scale reclamation of the land of forests and pastures for agriculture, but intensive plowing had exhausted the soil despite the practice of 3-field rotation of crops because clearance was not accompanied by proper soil conservation. The shortage of pasturage reduced the number of cattle. Population growth was outstripping resources, and the immediate result was famine. Severe famines hit Europe between 1315 and 1317, followed in the 1320s by massive cattle deaths. In addition, trade was hit by a severe shortage of metal money because of a shortfall in the output of silver mines in Austria and Serbia. This forced governments to reduce the silver content of currency and to mix it with cheaper metals. The worst was yet to come. As trade expanded in the 13th and 14th centuries, ships carrying goods from the distant countries had started arriving in the European ports. Along with the ships came rats carrying the deadly bubonic plague infection. Western Europe, relatively isolated in earlier centuries, was hit by epidemic between 1347 and 1350. The modern estimate of mortality in that epidemic is that 20% of the people of the whole of Europe died, with some places losing as much as 40% of the population. How many valiant men, how many fair ladies had breakfast with their kinfolk and same night supped with their censors in the next world? The condition of the people was pitiable to behold. They sickened by the thousands daily and died unattended and without help. Many died in the open street, others dying in their houses, made it known by the stench of their rotting bodies. Consecrated churchyards did not suffice for the burial of the vast multitude of bodies, which were heaped by the hundreds in vast trenches, like goods in a ship, whole and covered with a little earth. Giovanni Boccaccio, Italian author. As trade centers, cities were the hardest hit. In enclosed communities like monasteries and convents, when individual contracted the plague, it was not long before everyone did, and in almost every case none survived. The plague took its worst toll among the infants, the young, and the elderly. There were other relatively minor episodes of plague in the 1360s and 1370s. The population of Europe, 73 million in 1300, stood reduced to 45 million in 1400. This catastrophe, combined with the economic crisis, caused immense social dislocation. Depopulation resulted in a major shortage of labor. Serious imbalances were created between agriculture and manufacture because there were not enough people to engage in both equally. Prices of agricultural goods dropped as there were fewer people to buy. Wage rates increased because the demand of labor, particularly agricultural labor, rose in England by as much as 250% in the aftermath of the Black Death. The surviving labor force could now demand twice their earlier wages. Social unrest. The income of lords was thus badly hit. It declined as agricultural prices came down and the wages of laborers increased. In desperation, they tried to give up the money contracts they had entered into and revive labor services. This was violently opposed by peasants, and particularly the better educated and more prosperous ones. In 1323, peasants revolted in Flanders, in 1358 in France, and in 1381 in England. Though these rebellions were ruthlessly crushed, it is significant that they occurred with the most violent intensity in those areas which they had experienced the prosperity of the economic expansion, a sign that peasants were attempting to protect the gains they had made in previous centuries. Despite the severe repression, the sheer intensity of peasant opposition ensured that the old feudal relations could not be reimposed. The money economy was too far advanced to be reversed. Therefore, though the lords succeeded in crushing the revolts, the peasants ensured that the feudal privileges of earlier days could not be reinvented. Political changes. Developments in the political sphere paralleled social processes. In the 15th and 16th centuries, European kings strengthened their military and financial power. The powerful new states they created were as significant for Europe as the economic changes that were occurring. Historians have therefore called these kings the new monarchs. Louis XI in France, Maximilian in Austria, Henry VII in England, and Isabel and Ferdinand in Spain were absolutist rulers who started the process of organizing standing armies, a permanent bureaucracy, and national taxation, and in Spain and Portugal began to play a role in Europe's expansion overseas. The most important reason for the triumph of these monarchies was the social changes which had taken place in the 12th and 13th centuries, the dissolution of the feudal system of lordship and vassalage, and the slow rate of economic growth had given the first opportunity to kings to increase their control over their powerful and not so powerful subjects. Rulers dispensed with the system of feudal levies for their armies and introduced professionally trained infantry equipped with guns and siege artillery directly under their control. The resistance of the aristocracies crumbled in the face of the firepower of the kings. By increasing taxes, monarchs got enough revenues to support larger armies and thus defended and expanded their frontiers and overcame internal resistance to royal authority. Centralization, however, did not occur without resistance from the aristocracy. A common thread running through all types of opposition to the monarchies was the question of taxation. In England, rebellions occurred and were put down in 1497, 1536, 1547, 1549, and 1553. In France, Louis XI had to wage a long struggle against dukes and princes. Lesser nobles, often members of local assemblies, resisted this loyal usurpation of their powers. The religious wars in France in the 16th century were in part a contest between royal privileges and regional liberties. The nobility managed a tactical shift in order to ensure their survival. From being opponents to the new regimes, they quickly transformed themselves into loyalists. It is for this reason that loyal absolutism had been called a modified form of feudalism. Precisely the same class of people who had been rulers in the feudal system, the lords, continued to dominate the political scene. They were given permanent positions in the administrative service, but the new regimes were different in some important ways. The king was no longer at the apex of the pyramid, where loyalty had been a matter of personal dependence and trust. He was now at the center of an elaborate courtier society and a network of patron client relationships. All monarchies, weak or powerful, needed the cooperation of those who could command authority. Patronage became the means of ensuring such cooperation, and patronage could be given or obtained by means of money. Therefore, money became an important way in which non aristocratic elements like merchants and bankers could gain access to the court. They lent money to the kings, who used it to pay the wages of soldiers. Rulers thus made space for non feudal elements in the state system. The latest history of France and England was to be shaped by these changes in the power structures. In the reign of the child King Louis XIII of France, in 1614, a meeting was held of the French Consultative Assembly, known as the Estates General, with three houses to represent the three estates, order, clergy, nobility, and the rest. After this, it was not summoned again for nearly 2 centuries, till 1789, because the kings did not want to share power with the three orders. What happened in England was very different. Even before the Norman conquerors, the Anglo-Saxons had a great council which the king had to consult before imposing any tax. This developed into what we call the Parliament, which consisted of the House of Lords, the members of which the lords and the clergy, and the House of Commons representing towns and rural areas. Kings King Charles I ruled for 11 years without calling Parliament. When he was forced to call it because he needed money, a section of Parliament decided to go to war against him and later executed him and established a republic. This did not last long, and monarchy was restored, but under condition that Parliament would be called regularly. Today, France had a republican form of government, and England has a monarchy. This is because of the different directions that the histories of the two countries took after the 17th century.